Hello. Hello. Good evening. Can you hear me, everyone? Yes. Um, Great. Yes, thanks for joining. Um, right. Um, Apparently, this is a dangerous place. Oh. Um, oh, sorry. Um, okay. So this evening, I'm going to talk. We might talk at some point. Second. Okay. Yeah. So last evening, I spoke about the weaponization of the Holocaust um, and the way in which this weaponization keeps us stuck in the 20th century, as I argued yesterday, and how we see it primarily in the case of Israel's attack on Gaza, Gesundheit. But also more broadly, when we think about Israeli history, since the 1948 Nakba until today. Um, and I also referred to other cases. And indeed, when we think about the weaponization of Holocaust history, it's not only about Israel. Israel is very foundational. And for those of you who weren't here yesterday, I'll repeat a number of things so that we're all on the same page when we discuss about the field of Holocaust and genocide studies, specifically in relation to Israel's attack on Gaza. Israel is very foundational, but it's not only Israel, and I referenced Putin's weaponization of Holocaust history in Russia invasion of Ukraine, and there are other cases that we can think about. So today, we're still very much, of course, with the issue of Israel's attack on Gaza and the question of genocide, but much more closely, we'll be looking at the field of Holocaust and genocide studies. And of course, the field, as you'll see, there's intersections with what's called global Holocaust memory. That is, again, as an institutional phenomena. So as it's managed through institutes of the state, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, and other institutes that together are this phenomena that we call, since the 90s, global Holocaust memory. So let's begin. In April 2022, Holocaust scholar Eugene Finkel, who just recently published a very important book on Russia's attack on Ukraine, wrote in the Washington Post an article titled, "What's Happening in Ukraine is Genocide, period." Finkel argued that following Ukrainian determination in resisting the Russian invasion, and here I'm quoting for Finkel, Russian thinking shifted from colonial to genocidal. Finkel saw Russian genocidal intent by looking at an infamous editorial on Russian state-owned RIA Novosti. The editorial argued that Ukraine was, quote, impossible as a nation state. This is the Russian editorial. The editorial also reflected mainstream narratives in Russia asserting that, quote, a substantial part of the population of Ukraine was also guilty of supporting its so-called Nazi government, and that the Ukrainian population would therefore require re-education, ideological repression, lasting at least a generation and leading to de-Ukrainization. All this in the Russian editorial. Finkel then reasonably concluded that it was, quote, hard to imagine a more actionable template to destroy a national group. And that combination of official statements denying Ukraine and Ukrainians the right to exist and mounting evidence of deliberate large-scale targeting of Ukrainian civilians left little room for doubt that the threshold from war crimes to genocide was crossed. Right? So Finkel was looking at basically Russian political and media discourse that was about denying and calling for the destruction of the Ukrainians as a people, as a national group. And he said, this is, a very clear evidence of genocidal intent, right? Applying the same standard indicated by Finkel to the Israeli mainstream political and media discourses about Palestinians, the threshold from war crimes to genocide, to use Finkel's formulation, has been crossed well before 7th of October 2023. In May 2023, a clear template to destroy a national group was proposed by Jeffrey Camras in an article in the Times of Israel. Second. Camras proposed that, quote, in order to right a wrong, listen carefully, this is, in order to right a wrong, in order to make peace and move forward, Palestine must be obliterated. It is an affront to society, morality, and humanity. It represents lies and anti-Semitism, oppression and terror, nothing more. Camras then also insisted that the Palestinians need to be re-educated, and that if Palestinians would like to enjoy rights, they must give up their nationhood, which constitutes in any case a lie. Now, Camras likely heard Israeli Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich, a far-right settler, assertion 2 months earlier that, quote, there's no such thing as the Palestinians. And of course, this has roots in Israeli political discourse, the idea that there is no such thing as Palestinians. This is very old, decades old. This annihilatory remark came after Smotrich called to wipe out the Palestinian village of Hawara, following an extremely violent attack on the village by Jewish settlers on 26th of February 2023. Israeli National Security Minister, another far-right settler, Itamar Ben-Gvir, contributed to this genocidal ideology by suggesting the conflation of Palestinians with terrorists. In February 2023, the New Yorker reported that, quote, in 2015, Ben-Gvir chided his followers to stop shouting death to the Arabs, which is very common actually in Israeli society. You should say instead, death to the terrorists. That's legal with a stamp. Similarly, in 2014, far-right Knesset member Ayelet Shaked, and here I have a typo, it should be Ayelet Shaked there, publicly appropriated the words of the late far-right Israeli writer Uri Elitzur and said the following: behind every terrorist stand dozens of men and women, without whom he could not engage in terrorism. They are all enemy combatants, and their blood shall be on all their heads. Now this also includes the mothers of the martyrs who send them to hell with flowers and kisses. They should follow their sons. Nothing would be more just. They should go, as should the physical homes in which they raised the snakes. Otherwise, more little snakes will be raised there. Thus, Israeli journalists and top policymakers denied Palestinians' existence, their right to a state and collective civilian protection well before 7th of October 2023. In a context of combined state crime and settler violence in 2023, which was the most lethal year for Palestinians in the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem since the Second Intifada ended in 2005. Israeli soldiers, police, and settlers killed nearly 200 Palestinians by early October, creating an environment of terror that pushed many Palestinians to flee their villages, with nearly no Palestinians left by August in the vast area stretching from Ramallah to Yericho. So there was a intensification, right, of ongoing Israeli ethnic cleansing in the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem, and marked intensification in 2023, well before October. Nevertheless, no Holocaust scholar, including Finkel, viewed this situation in the way that Finkel saw Russia's attack on Ukraine. Most Holocaust scholars, in fact, never even mentioned the large body of evidence of Israeli international crimes in the 56 years of Israeli occupation. This marginalization and disavowal of Israeli mass violence against Palestinian civilians by Holocaust scholars before the 7th of October morphed after the Hamas-led attack on 7th of October, in some cases into outright justification of Israeli violence. Even as Israel's attack on Gaza killed Palestinians at an average rate that by January 2024 exceeded, according to Oxfam, the daily death toll of any other case of mass violence in the 21st century. And this was January 2024. Palestinian casualties so far include, according to UN estimates, more than 45,000 Palestinians that Israel has killed, over 16,000 of them children, more than 100,000 injured, and at least 12,000 missing under the rubble and presumed dead. The actual number of Palestinians that Israel has killed so far is, without a doubt, far higher. Now, scholars working more broadly in Holocaust and genocide studies, that is not more specifically in Holocaust studies, those working in Holocaust and genocide studies thus took a different stance, many of them, after 7th of October, focusing on Israel's extremely violent attack on Gaza, including, at least at the beginning, the possibility of genocide. Now, 14 months into this genocide, the evidence of genocide, according to international law, is overwhelming. But at the time, at the beginning, at least the possibility, the risk of genocide. The very different ways in which Holocaust scholars on the one hand and those working in genocide studies on the other have responded to the unfolding mass violence in Israel and Palestine after 7th of October point to an unprecedented crisis in Holocaust and genocide studies. I suggest that the crisis stems from the significant evidence for genocide in Israel's attack on Gaza, which has exposed the exceptional status accorded to Israel as a foundational element in the field. That is, the idea that Israel, the state of Holocaust survivors, can never perpetrate genocide. Right? The idea that Israel is not able to perpetrate this crime, is not really able to perpetrate any crime under international law. So in what follows, I first will trace the responses of global Holocaust memory institutes after 7th of October as a reflection of this exceptional status. And here again, I mean institutes that create and maintain ideas about the Holocaust through commemoration, through their work with teachers and educators, and through significant financial contributions and support for research to scholars and to students, right? So there's an overlap between global Holocaust memory institutes, of course, and scholars and students in the field of Holocaust and genocide studies. This means that global Holocaust memory institutes shape in significant ways the work of students and scholars in the field. The next part, I'll talk about the responses of scholars themselves in the field and weaving this into a narrative of the unfolding Israeli attack on Gaza. I'll then provide some recent historical perspective to understand the current crisis in Holocaust and genocide studies. So we'll look a bit at how we got here in the field. And I'll conclude with a discussion of the possibility I see of moving from unprecedented crisis, right, to unprecedented change. So like yesterday, for those who were here, right, I don't see this as completely dark and, hopeless, right? We are at a moment, as I argued yesterday, of unprecedented crisis and unbelievable unfolding genocidal violence for more than 14 months now, but we're also at a moment of unprecedented potential for unprecedented change. So, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum issued a statement on 8th of October in response to the Hamas-led attack on Israel the previous day, which included the Hamas-led attack, the mass murder of more than 850 Israeli civilians, around 250 soldiers and officers, and migrant workers, the destruction of Israeli towns and neighborhoods, and the abduction of more than 240 Israeli and migrant workers. The museum rightly condemned the attack and called for the immediate release of all the hostages. Israel's subsequent violent assault on Gaza had just begun, and it was not immediately clear how it would unfold. The following days, however, provided many indications that Israel intended to inflict unprecedented levels of mass killing and destruction on Gaza. The next day, on 9th of October, Israeli War Minister Yoav Gallant, and as I said yesterday, I really insist on calling him War Minister rather than Defense Minister, proclaimed, as we know, total siege on Gaza, cutting off food, water, fuel, and medical supplies, and stating that Israel is fighting human animals. The USHMM had nothing to say about this explicitly dehumanizing language in its next press release. And it's important to say that scholars in Holocaust and genocide studies who also teach in universities like me, right, one of the rationales of doing this is to teach students, right, to notice that an unfolding process is unfolding in a way that's supposed to turn on the red lights, right? That something is terribly wrong, right? Dehumanizing language, as we explain to students again and again and again, is one of those massive red lights, right? But the museum had nothing to say about that. In the next press release on the unfolding violence on 11th October, which consisted of a letter signed by 33 Holocaust survivors who volunteer in the museum. They described the Hamas-led attack without a word on the, quote, thousands of tons of munitions that had already been dropped on the Gaza Strip in just a few days. We forget how brutal the first actually couple of weeks of Israel's attack on Gaza, which was primarily aerial bombardment, right, were. Even Israeli army spokesperson Daniel Hagari, right, openly said on 10th of October that now we are focused on what causes maximum damage, right? So this was open, this form of attack in the first couple of weeks. On 13th of October, Israel ordered more than 1 million Palestinians to leave immediately the northern part of Gaza and move to the south, Israel's first evacuation order. A measure that the legal team representing South Africa at the International Court of Justice argued was already genocidal. Rather than humanitarian measures, as the Israeli legal team at the Hague described the evacuation orders, the evacuations have actually led to the forcible displacement of nearly 2 million Palestinians in Gaza now, basically almost all the 2.3 million Palestinians in the Strip, under conditions of intense bombing, including on Israeli designated safe areas, and of course, while forcing people to move under total siege, right? So without water, clean water, without food, without medicine. And remember that this is after a 16-year-old siege on the Gaza Strip. We forget that when Gallant on 9th of October declared total siege, right? He actually coined a new term, total siege, because Gaza was already under siege for 16 years, right? So the total siege was immediately felt by Palestinians in Gaza, and that's the conditions in which they were supposed to evacuate on safe routes and into safe zones that Israel in any case was bombing, right? That's the reason that the legal team of South Africa and The Hague argued that this measure, right, was actually weaponization of international humanitarian law, not meant to protect civilians, but actually to enhance their targeting. A journalist and translator in Gaza, conveyed this terror in a voice message to a friend on 15th of October. And from the beginning, Palestinians in Gaza sent voice messages and text messages, which are a form of testimony, really. And he said the following: I am still in my home in Gaza City. Many people fled to the south, but many stayed here in the north after they saw the massacre of 70 people and more than 200 injured on the road south. And then, after that, there was so much bombing in the south, massacres. People left Gaza City, went to the south, and sought shelter with people there, and then they all got shelled. You even have people who fled to the south and came back to Gaza City. This forced displacement, furthermore, occurred under the conditions, as I said, of Israel siege. In A's message on 15th of October, he reported that, quote, there's no water at all. It's a huge problem. It's catastrophic. Indeed, Israel's evacuation order on 13th of October was designed to create catastrophe, or, in the language of the UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, it demonstrated intent to destroy Palestinians as such, rather than target only Hamas, because, and this is one of the forms of violence in the convention, it deliberately created conditions calculated to bring about the physical destruction of the group in whole or in part, which is the third form of violence in the convention. Right? When you force people to leave their homes with no food, with no water, with no medicine. I'm not even talking about the sick, the people in the hospitals, babies, pregnant women, but everyone, right, under conditions of intense bombing, of course, right, you create conditions for the physical destruction of people. The proof for this, as the South African team stressed, was in the conditions of acute food insecurity and the spread of infectious disease among hundreds of thousands of Palestinians in Gaza already in December 2023. And we know that if Israel's attack stops now, Palestinians in Gaza will continue to die in large numbers from hunger, disease, and the lasting effect of Israel's attack. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of people, right? That if Israel's attack stops now, we'll still see hundreds of thousands of Palestinians in Gaza die as a result of the conditions that Israel created intentionally. The University of Southern California Shoah Foundation, which is the Spielberg collection of testimonies, which is another institute of global Holocaust memory, interpreted the situation on 13th of October very, very differently. Executive Director Joel Citron and Board Chair Dr. Robert J. Williams described Hamas in their message that day as an organization, quote, with an ideology rooted in anti-Semitism. They promised that our programming will expand so that it not only creates opportunities for people to learn about and remember the Shoah, but also other victims of the same irrational hatred that led to the Holocaust and that persists today. The Shoah Foundation, in other words, like the USHMM, presented the Hamas-led attack on Israel in the context of the Holocaust and anti-Semitism, legitimizing what former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett said in an interview on Sky News just the previous day, on 12th of October. He said, "We're fighting Nazis." Right? the Shoah Foundation legitimized the Israeli state view that Palestinians in Gaza are Nazis. Now, this weaponization of the Holocaust erases Israeli history, right? It jumps from the Holocaust to the 7th of October. There's nothing in between. And turns the world upside down. A powerless people, forcibly displaced and attacked under decades of Israeli settler colonialism, military occupation, and siege, become the worst perpetrators in modern imagination, Nazis. And this image then casts the settler colonial state, armed with nuclear weapons and backed by all the key major powers, as the ultimate victims of modern imagination, Jews facing Nazis. Now, the depiction of Palestinians as Nazis disrupts, actually, an axiom in Israeli politics and society that the Holocaust is incomparable and unique, right? Because if the Holocaust is incomparable and unique, then Palestinians can't be Nazis, actually, right? But at the same time, it strengthens another dominant idea that stems from the view of the Holocaust as unique, that Israel, where many Holocaust survivors try to build their lives, is a unique state, right? The state of Holocaust survivors, the response to the Nazis. The concept, I explained this yesterday, and I'll repeat this here for those who were not here yesterday, that the concept of genocide functioned from its formulation in the UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide in 1948, exactly in relation to this double uniqueness of the Holocaust in Israel. Nazism and the Holocaust were put on a hierarchy as more terrible than genocide, right? And that's why we have this strange field that's called Holocaust and Genocide Studies, which is a very strange title, right? The Holocaust was a genocide, but that's the hierarchy. And then Israel was then placed on another imagined hierarchy as more moral than any other state in the world, with an army that is the most moral in the world. And the net result is that from Israel's establishment from the very beginning, it became unimaginable, right, and unthinkable that Israel could really perpetrate any crime under international law because it's unique, it's exceptional, it's the state of the survivors, right? And of course, not genocide. Maintaining this foundational image of Israel required the denial of the Nakba, Israel's foundational crime, the mass deportations of 750,000 Palestinians and the destruction of hundreds of Palestinians' towns and villages, including massacres of 15,000 Palestinians during the 1948 war. So this foundational crime, which everyone saw and knew, had to be denied immediately in order to maintain this foundational image. And the denial of the Nakba then also stemmed from the broader impetus to deny the nature of the Israeli state as a settler colonial project. So the impunity for Israel in the international legal system, this impunity that is foundational, is reflected also in the exceptional status of Israel in the field of Holocaust and genocide studies. Notwithstanding the mountain of evidence of Israeli mass violence and crude violations of international law, really there's a mountain of evidence, and as I said yesterday, a very large library of research and scholarship on this. Right? Scholars, programs, centers, museums, and journals in the field of Holocaust and genocide studies, for the most part, minimized, marginalized, and disavowed this history, even though it's incredibly documented. Now, this is reflected. Anyone here has been to Yad Vashem? Wow. So this is reflected in the landscape of Yad Vashem, Israel's main Holocaust museum and memorial site, and also itself, after the 90s, a global Holocaust Memory Institute, which is built according to the Palestinian sociologist Huneida Ghanim, upon Khirbat el-Khama land, near the ruins of the Palestinian village of Dil Yassin, and the displaced Palestinian village of Ein Karim. Now, this balcony here, which looks at a beautiful Jerusalem hill landscape, right, is at the very end of the new museum that was built in 2005. It's built into the mountain. So you come in from the first, from one side of the mountain, and you go through to the other end, and you end up after a few hours on this balcony. And the vast majority, probably almost all the visitors to the museum, when they go and they stand on this beautiful balcony, have no idea that they're looking at the site of a massacre, the Dil Yassin massacre, where Israeli forces massacred over 100 Palestinians in Dil Yassin in 1948. It should not, therefore, also come as a surprise that Dani Dayan, the chairman of Yad Vashem since 2021, is a settler who served from 2007 to 2013 as the chairperson of the Yesha Council, which is the umbrella organization of Jewish settlements in the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem. Dayan, the chairman of Yad Vashem, took pride in 2015 that because of his tenure as the council's chairperson, a Palestinian state, as he said, today is farther than ever. The blurring of Israeli mass violence against Palestinians, like this, right, in the landscape and in the Holocaust memory and education landscape in Israel, also figures in the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum permanent exhibition. Has anyone been to the USHMM? Well, the permanent exhibition concludes with the establishment of the State of Israel, and of course, without a word about the Nakba or Palestinians. They simply don't exist, right? I mean, it's actually weird that the exhibit, in any case, ends with the establishment of the State of Israel, right? But if it ends with the State of Israel and there's no mention of the Nakba, no mention of Palestinians, okay. There's much, much more to say about the institutes, but let's move on now more closely to the scholars. Now, if Holocaust scholars remained mostly silent as Israel's attack on Gaza, Gesundheit, intensified quickly in the week after 7th of October, in the weeks after 7th of October, more than 15 scholars who work more broadly in Holocaust and genocide studies added their names to a statement of more than 800 scholars and practitioners of international law, conflict studies, and genocide studies. They did so in the language of the statement, quote, to sound the alarm about the possibility of the crime of genocide being perpetrated by Israeli forces against Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. We do not do so lightly, they said, recognizing the weight of this crime, but the gravity of the situation demands it. Now, scholars whose work has shaped the field of Holocaust and genocide studies, like Omer Bartov, Marian Kaplan, and others, were among these 15 Holocaust and genocide studies scholars that added their names to these hundreds of other scholars, a lot of them in international law, human rights. On 29th of October, as Israel began its ground invasion into Gaza, Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu expressed genocidal intent clearly in religious terms, invoking the biblical story of the total destruction of Amalek by the Israelites. Gravely concerned, Holocaust scholar Omer Bartov, also like me, an Israeli, also like me, a Jew, gave an interview to Mehdi Hassan on MSNBC on 3rd of November, where he talked about, quote, the possibility of genocide staring us in the face. He explained that while we hear clear statements of genocidal intent, what is happening right now, he said, in Gaza, can quite clearly be seen as war crimes, potentially also crimes against humanity. Possibly it may become genocide. I don't think what is happening now is genocide. This is Bartov on 29th of October. Bartov pointed instead to Israel's intent to commit ethnic cleansing, citing a document of the Israeli Ministry of Intelligence from 13th of October, outlining a plan to remove all Palestinians from Gaza to the Sinai Desert across the border in Egypt. He repeated this view a week later in an article in the New York Times, also urging, quote, such venerable institutions as the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., and Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, to step in now and stand at the forefront of those warning against war crimes, crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing, and the crime of all crimes, genocide. There is still time to stop Israel from letting its actions become a genocide, he concluded. We cannot wait a moment longer. This is Bartov in October. Writing in The Guardian in June, in The Guardian in June 2024, many moments later, Bartov argued that at least since Israel's invasion of Rafah in May 2024, its attack now also included genocidal actions, as he put it. The following sentences, however, presented a far harsher assessment, and this is what he said. This is in June. It was not just that this attack against the last concentration of Gazans, most of them displaced already several times, which now once again pushed them to a so-called safe zone, demonstrated a total disregard of any humanitarian standards. It also clearly indicated that the ultimate goal of this entire undertaking from the very beginning, right, had been to make the entire Gaza Strip uninhabitable and to debilitate its population to such a degree that it would either die or seek all possible options to flee the territory. In other words, the rhetoric spouted by Israeli leaders since 7th of October was now being translated into reality, namely, as the 1948 UN Genocide Convention puts it, that Israel was acting with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, the Palestinian population in Gaza as such by killing, causing serious harm, or inflicting conditions of life meant to bring about the group's destruction. So Bartov changed his mind, right, very significantly from October to June, and actually even said that in June, his assessment that yes, from the very beginning, we were actually witnessing genocidal violence. Now, while the USHMM said nothing about Israel's attack on Gaza, as we saw, it was the Center for Constitutional Rights that I also mentioned yesterday that decided to follow Bartov's urging and wait no longer, right? And again, this is part of what Bartov wrote was very important actually in October, right? We cannot wait any longer, because part of the rationale of studying genocide, this idea of genocide prevention, is this thing that we don't actually reach a point where we can look back and say, oh, this was a genocide, right? But no, we see an unfolding process that clearly tells us that this is genocide, right? And we work to prevent it, genocide prevention, right? Stop it, right? Intervene in time. So it was the Center for Constitutional Rights, not any Holocaust Institute, that did that. On 13th of November 2023, it filed a lawsuit in federal court in California on behalf of Palestinian organizations and individuals against President Biden, US President Biden, Secretary of State Blinken, and Secretary of Defense Austin, charging them with failure to prevent genocide in Israel's attack on Gaza, according to the legal obligations of states that are party to the Genocide Convention. And of course, they charged them more than that with complicity with genocide due to the large-scale military and diplomatic support that the US government, under their direction, has provided Israel since 7th of October. The CCR requested that in view of the evidence of an unfolding genocidal assault, or at least a clear risk of genocide, and clear risk is what activates the convention, right? The judge they asked for a preliminary injunction to order the US government to stop its support for Israel. And as we know, this is very important because without US support, as is clear, Israel could not have perpetrated this genocide. So we really need to think about this as an Israel-US genocide. Right? Senior Holocaust and Genocide Studies scholars Victoria Sanford, Barry Trachtenberg, and John Cox filed a declaration in support of the CCR lawsuit on 16th of November. They explained that Israel's attack on Gaza constitutes genocide because of clear statements of intent and the unprecedented levels of mass killing and destruction. They also showed how the genocide against the Maya people in Guatemala in 1982, the Rwanda genocide in 1994, the genocide against Bosnian Muslims in 1995, the genocide in Darfur from 2003 to 2004, the genocide that ISIS carried out against Yazidis in northern Iraq in 2014, and Myanmar's genocidal attack on Rohingya in 2016-2017 are all alarmingly resemble Israel's attack on Gaza. And they detailed how exactly in their declaration. It's all online. If you look at the Center for Constitutional Rights, the specific case, you can find it there. Now, Trachtenberg and Cox are scholars who have published widely on Nazism and the Holocaust. Victoria Sanford is a scholar of Guatemala, the Guatemala genocide. The following day, on 17th of November, a group of over 150 Holocaust scholars, primarily Holocaust scholars, took a very different position in a statement that they posted online. Like the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and the Shaw Foundation, these scholars separated the Hamas attack on 7th of October from the history of Israel and Palestine, placing it instead in the context of the Holocaust and claiming that the atrocities that they, quote, unavoidably bring to mind the mindset and the methods of the perpetrators of the pogroms that paved the way to the final solution. So again, reproducing the Israeli state view and the rationale for Israel's genocide in Gaza. The statement includes no mention of any form, actually, of Israeli state violence, right? So there's no violence whatsoever in the statement. This kind of outright denial reflects the way in which, in contrast to Bartov, to Cox, to Trachtenberg, and to Sanford, the Holocaust scholars who signed this statement, and there's quite a lot of them, 150, understand the legacy of the Shoah as one that provides license to state violence rather than protection to groups facing it. Now, these scholars may have felt emboldened by well-known Holocaust scholar Yehuda Bauer, who wrote in the Times of Israel in November a horrible article. He had passed away since then, by the way, a couple months ago. He was very old. In November 2023, and this is really a founding figure of Holocaust studies, Yehuda Bauer. In early November, he, in this article, presented Israel's attack against Hamas barbarism, right, so colonial language, as an absolute necessity, right? Israel attack is an absolute necessity to protect, quote, a more or less civilized society, right? So we have civilization, we have barbarism, right? We're explicitly within a colonial framework. Mirroring the dehumanizing rhetoric in Israeli politics and society, Bauer described, quote, two worldviews that appeal to different types of the human universe. I'll read that again. Two worldviews that appeal to different types of the human universe. So explicit racism of the worst kind. This is one of the founding figures of Holocaust scholarship. This required, he continued, a relentless struggle. So a full justification of Israel's genocidal assault in Gaza. A group of 5 Holocaust scholars, Avinoam Pat, Lara Yokosh, Dina Porat, Liat Shter Livni, and Tuvia Freeling, both Israelis and not Israelis, elaborated in more detail on Bauer's framework in an article in Haaretz on 28th of November, which came actually, they were responding directly to Bartov's New York Times article that I mentioned before. And they said the following: "We acknowledge that what some Israeli leaders have said are truly despicable statements that cannot be ignored. Dehumanizing terrorists who raped women, decapitated babies, tortured their victims, shot and burned them alive, however, is not evidence of genocidal intent, but a reflection of the limits of language to describe behavior that truly seems inhuman." Now, let's unpack this for a minute. Some Israeli leaders include, in fact, all Israeli leaders. Right? The organization Law for Palestine has documented genocidal statements in Israel since 7th of October. There is dozens of statements of intent to destroy in the language of the UN Convention, Genocide Convention, by state leaders, senior army officers, and specifically war cabinet ministers, right? So these people with command authority in international law. Dozens and dozens of these statements, right? All Israeli leaders, right? And then there's hundreds of genocidal rhetoric in Israeli society and politics and media in addition to that. So some Israeli leaders, as they said, are actually all Israeli leaders, which is the reason that the ICJ rejected the attempt by the Israeli team in The Hague to minimize the explicit expressions of genocidal intent, and quoting the court itself, quoting these statements, ruled, as we know, on 26th of January 2024, that Israel is plausibly perpetrating genocide in Gaza. But not for these scholars, right? Who also, like Bauer, reinforced the colonial framework of Palestinians as savages by writing, again, and I'm quoting again this sentence, "Dehumanizing terrorists is not evidence of genocidal intent, but a reflection of the limits of language to describe behavior that truly seems inhuman." Right? Humans don't act like this. This is colonial rationalization in a very basic way. Right? Now, it's interesting that decades of scholarship on perpetrators of mass atrocities as ordinary men, including Holocaust perpetrators, right? There's a subfield of studying perpetrators and studying Holocaust perpetrators and seeing them today, right, as ordinary men. Doesn't apply in this case for these Holocaust scholars, right? These are not ordinary men. For good measure, these 5 Holocaust scholars also threw in the lie about decapitated babies, right? Even though by the end of November, when they were writing, it was already established clearly as Israeli war and atrocity propaganda. There were no decapitated babies. There were a lot of atrocities on the 7th of October, on the Hamas-led attack on Israel on 7th of October, but there were no decapitated babies, right? For these Holocaust scholars, reality does not matter. In response to this, and of course, atrocity propaganda, again, is a key justification and rationalization of Israel's attack on Gaza, right? These are savages. In response to this sort of justification for Israel's genocidal assault on Gaza by Holocaust scholars, a group of 60 Holocaust and Genocide Studies scholars published a statement on 9th of December that I organized that addresses the evidence for war crimes and crimes against humanity in the Hamas-led attack on 7th of October, but also the evidence for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide in Israel's attack on Gaza. We address the widespread and extreme incitement to genocide in Israeli politics and society, because incitement to genocide is another crime, right, in the convention. And the grave danger in this situation also for Palestinians under Israeli military occupation in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and for Palestinian citizens of Israel. Our statement also invokes the legal obligations of states that ratified the UN Genocide Convention to stop and prevent genocide and not to aid and abet perpetrators of genocide. And we called for the implementation of an arms embargo on Israel. And finally, we asked scholars, programs, centers, and institutes in Holocaust and genocide studies to take a clear stance against Israeli mass violence and join us in efforts to stop it and prevent its further escalation. Now, the 17th of November statement by Holocaust scholars and this one by Holocaust and Genocide Studies scholars demonstrate not just a divide in the field, but, as I argue, a deep crisis. But as I said, this crisis has roots well before 7th of October. So let's just look at this very, very briefly, this historical roots of this crisis. As mentioned, the Shoah Foundation depiction of the Hamas attack on Israel on 7th of October in the framework of the Holocaust and anti-Semitism is designed to erase Israeli history, quite literally to skip over it, right? From Holocaust to Hamas. The key aspect of Israeli history that this move erases is, of course, Israeli settler colonialism and Israeli settler colonial violence. The weaponization of the struggle against anti-Semitism to disavow and deny Israeli settler colonialism, right? This is Holocaust and anti-Semitism, the 7th of October, this weaponization emerged well before 7th of October. It actually emerged as Israeli state policy in the 1990s. Now, why then? In the 1990s, settler colonialism emerged as a central category in research on Israel. That is, besides Palestinian scholars who have been writing about Israeli settler colonialism since the 50s, of course, right? But in the 1990s, others started to write about this, right? Palestinians, yes, so now we have other scholars writing about this. Now, the growing significance in the 1990s of the category of settler colonialism, also we see it in research not only on Israel, of course, but also in the US, on Canada, on Australia, right? There's a lot of research starting to happen on settler colonialism, also in work by indigenous scholars, and this too contributes to this paradigm shift in relation to Israel and settler colonialism. We also see the increasingly important place of oral histories of Palestinians on the Nakba, again, more and more since the 1990s, which highlight the long-term process of Israel's assault on Palestinian society and culture, which is what Palestinians have always called an ongoing Nakba that lays bare its settler colonial elements. Now, according to British Jewish writer Anthony Lehrman, who published a very important book recently that's called Whatever Happened to Anti-Semitism, he says that the Israeli government perceived these changes as serious threats, right? It's kind of new research on settler colonialism. And by the late 1990s, had managed to focus the international discourse about anti-Semitism on a new orthodoxy, anti-Zionism as the new anti-Semitism. Global Holocaust Memory Institutes became a central sphere for this Israeli policy of turning Holocaust history and the struggle against anti-Semitism into weapons of the Israeli government when, in 2016, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, IHRA, adopted the working definition of anti-Semitism. Now, IHRA is a central force in the institutional world of global Holocaust memory. It's made of 35 member states, including Israel, almost all of them from Europe, but also including Israel, Canada, the US, Argentina, and Australia. And it deals with Holocaust education, research, and remembrance. Now, the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism includes a very vague definition, which is not actually the problem. The problem is this with the 11 examples attached to the definition and are considered an integral part of the document, because 7 of them focus on Zionism and Israel and not at all on Jews, right? And there's a clear difference between a state and a political ideology, Zionism and Israel, and a people, Jews. This means that the IHRA definition conflates very clearly criticism of a state, right, and violence against a group. Now, this turns the historical struggle against anti-Semitism on its head. Rather than protecting a people from discriminatory, exclusionary, and violent states, the IHRA definition protects a state from criticism of its discrimination, exclusion, and violence against a people, Palestinians. One example, one of the examples is that it's anti-Semitic to claim that the existence of the state of Israel is a racist endeavor, right? So to say that Israel is a racist state is anti-Semitic. Now, the document above the examples also has a brief explanation that says that criticism of Israel similar to that leveled against any other country cannot be regarded as anti-Semitism, right? So it cautions that if it's criticism that is like criticism against any other country, that's not anti-Semitism. Now, by 2016, when this was adopted, the criticism of systematic racism have been leveled against many, many states. The United States, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, a million states, right? So the document here presents a crude contradiction of itself, right? The only state where you can't say it's racism is Israel. All other states, it's fine, right? Why? Because this denial serves as a mechanism of disavowing Israeli settler colonialism, right? If we can't talk about racism, we can't talk about settler colonialism. So this is actually a very sophisticated way, this disavowal, right, to push away settler colonialism without even mentioning it. Now, as the weaponization of the struggle against anti-Semitism conflates criticism of a state with an attack on people, it collapses the distinction between them. Indeed, not all Israelis are Jews. 20% are actually Palestinians. And not all Jews are Israelis. This weaponization, therefore, reproduces the exclusionary nature of the Israeli nation state as a Jewish state, and an extremely problematic view that aligns all Jews with Israel. This is, of course, extremely problematic, for it affirms the really anti-Semitic idea that Jews are never loyal to their states, right? If all Jews are actually Israelis, then they're not loyal to their states. Both Biden and Trump, by the way, called American Jews Israelis, both of them. This weaponization then also tags anti-Zionist Jews as anti-Semites, which is again really anti-Semitic, because it attacks Jews for the way that they express their Jewish identity as anti-Zionism. This upside-down world, furthermore, shifts the focus away from very real anti-Semitism, and there's no shortage of it, and from the very real Israeli state violence against Palestinians, right? So we're not talking about what's very real. We're talking about this imaginary conflation. So on 8th of November, 8th of November 2024, the USHMM had a press release in response to the clash between Israeli soccer fans and Dutch pro-Palestinian people in Amsterdam the previous day. You've heard of that? Yeah, that you've heard, right? This constitutes the most recent example of this weaponization in the frame of global Holocaust memory, of this attempt to create a world turned upside down. Because photos and videos and witness accounts have made it easy, actually, to reconstruct what happened in Amsterdam. That is, on 6th of November, Israeli soccer fans arrived in Amsterdam for a match between the Israeli Maccabi Tel Aviv team and the Dutch Ajax Amsterdam team. The Israeli fans burned a Palestinian flag that evening in the central square, vandalized the taxi, attacked houses where Palestinian flags were displayed, and chanted Israeli fascist songs, including one celebrating the mass murder of Palestinian children in Gaza. This is all in public, recorded, right? Anti-Arab singing continued the next day as Israeli fans made their way to the stadium. After the game, which passed relatively quietly, some pro-Palestinian Dutch people responded to the behavior of the Israeli soccer fans and attacked them, injuring a few dozen. Okay? That's largely what happened, all right? The USHMM press release simply erased everything that happened before the game, right? This is also very much the method of mainstream media still today, right? It's as if we're in the 1980s, right? They'll tell us what's happening and we don't have any phones, right? That's it, right? So the USHMM simply erased what happened before the game, which facilitated a description of the attack on the Israeli fans as anti-Semitism, right? Museum chairman Eisenstadt, quoted in the press release, said the following: "This event is especially chilling, coming just as we mark the 86th anniversary of the November pogrom, Kristallnacht, when Jews throughout Nazi Germany were systematically attacked by Nazis as fellow citizens looked on. Holocaust history is an urgent reminder about the dangers of silence and complicity and the need for all societies to aggressively confront anti-Semitism." Now, the USHMM's erasure here is truly shocking, considering the ample documentation and evidence, and that commitment to truth is an essential part of what institutes like the USHMM call lessons of the Holocaust. The distorted connection also between what happened in Amsterdam and Kristallnacht in Nazi Germany, right, and there's absolutely no connection between these two, based on the weaponized conflation of a state, Israel, and a people, Jews, displays disregard for the actual experiences of Holocaust survivors and for the danger of the very real silence and complicity of the USHMM itself here, in the face of an outright genocidal rhetoric of Israeli soccer fans in the central square of the city, right? The attack against the Israeli soccer fans, of course, had nothing to do with anti-Semitism and everything to do with Israeli genocidal violence in Gaza. And the weaponization of the struggle against anti-Semitism is denied exactly to deny it. So this is a bit of historical background that brings us to today to understand, where this weaponized discourse comes from and how now it manifests itself in these institutes and among scholars in the field. So a few 5, 6 more minutes to suggest now how we might be able to move from intense crisis to significant change. So global Holocaust memory institutes and in tandem with them the field of Holocaust and genocide studies have enabled and legitimized Nakba denial and the disavowal of Israeli settler colonialism and its destructive violence against Palestinians, including the last 14 months. It is not, therefore, surprising that an online search reveals that the number of articles on the Nakba, Palestinians, or Gaza, for instance, in the US-based journal Holocaust and Genocide Studies, or in the UK-based Holocaust Studies, a journal of culture and history, can be really counted on one hand. What is more, how many Palestinians students in the US, for example, choose a BA minor, an undergraduate minor in Holocaust and Genocide Studies? Usually 0. How many Palestinian students apply to graduate programs in Holocaust and Genocide Studies around the world? Usually 0. How many Palestinian scholars identify themselves as scholars in the field? Right? A couple. Now, it is, of course, true that many cases of mass violence in the past and in the present, genocide or not, have been and are marginalized and disavowed within Holocaust and genocide studies. This deserves a different talk. But this moment of reckoning with the foundational case of marginalization, because as I argued, Israel is foundational in Holocaust and genocide studies, and it's not just marginalization and disavowal, it's also terribly, as we saw, justification, right? It's justification of genocide. In our fields, this holds potential for the kind of systemic change that we badly need in the way we study and teach about the Holocaust, but more broadly, mass violence. Now, the provisional rulings, the 3 provisional rulings of the ICJ in January, March, and May, that Israel is plausibly committing genocide in Gaza, moved us in this direction. Also, the ICC arrest warrants against Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu and former War Minister Gallant. This is the first Western leader ever to face arrest warrants by the ICC. Right? This is very, very significant. They move us in this direction because it means the beginning of the end of this impunity that Israel has always enjoyed in the international legal system, and therefore also the end of its exceptional status in Holocaust and genocide studies. This is perhaps the reason that some Holocaust scholars, such as the ones that wrote this article in Haaretz back in November 2023, who sought at the time to rationalize Israel's assault on Gaza, have now, for the most part, gone silent. Right? Now, if denial of nationhood should raise the alarm about the risk of genocide, as Finkel argued, and rightly so, in relation to Russia's attack on Ukraine, it also points to the importance of the perspectives, the voices, and the knowledge of those who face genocide, those who state authorities seek to silence as an integral part of the assault against them. I mean, we are living in this global Holocaust memory world in the era of the witness, right? The voices of the survivors, that's part of the lessons of the Holocaust. Journal of Genocide Research, alone among scholarly journals in Holocaust and Genocide Studies, only this journal, Journal of Genocide Research, has in the last few years, under the leadership of its senior editor, Dirk Moses, published important research on Israeli mass violence against Palestinians, including, very significantly, the work of Palestinian scholars. Two book forums in Journal of Genocide Studies before 7th of October are particularly important. In 2019, the journal published a book forum on incarcerated childhood and the politics of unchilding by Palestinian scholar Nader Shalib-Kevorkian, a very, very important book, by the way. The second forum published the following year in 2020 on the edited volume, The Holocaust and the Nakba, A New Grammar of Trauma and History, edited by Palestinian political scientist Bashir Bashir and Israeli Jewish historian Amos Goldberg, another very important volume. The forum about the edited volume, The Holocaust and the Nakba, also included, in addition to Bashir Bashir, the perspectives of two other Palestinian scholars, Nadia Abu al-Hajj and Amal Jamal. Right? So there were Palestinian voices, right, in the journal before 7th of October, discussing very important scholarship by Palestinians on Israel, on Israeli state violence. Then after October 2023, the journal initiated two forums in response to the unfolding violence. One titled Gaza, International Humanitarian Law and Genocide, and the other with a title that very much clearly recognizes the issue at the heart of the lecture. It's called Israel-Palestine, Atrocity Crimes and the Crisis of Holocaust and Genocide Studies. Today, there's nearly 20 essays in both of these forums, and it's growing more, including a couple by Palestinians, this one by Nimil Sultani. Notice how many views it has, right? It was published in May, right? So more than 16,000 views right now. And it's very important. It's really an article that he's an international legal scholar, and it's really an article that lays out very, very clearly the issue of intent and the duty of prevention in a very, very, very clear way. So these new voices of Palestinian scholars in the frame of Holocaust and genocide studies, together with the voices of dozens of other scholars in the field, such as Victoria Sanford, Barry Trachtenberg, Omer Bartov, and others, point, I would like to suggest, to a new era of Holocaust and genocide studies, past the denial of the Nakba and the silencing of Palestinians, to the emergence, well, I called it yesterday, for those who were here, of global Nakba memory, culture, perhaps, but certainly to the emergence of a new focus on the Nakba within Holocaust and genocide studies, right, as well as in the, of course, unfolding genocide in front of our eyes now in Gaza. So if Israel's genocidal assault in Gaza exposed, as it did, a deep crisis in Holocaust and genocide studies that was in crisis before 7th of October, right? It also prompted now a process of unprecedented change that may materialize. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It was very, very interesting. And I think even more it was needed. I'm going to read my question because it's going to be, it's going to be easier. I thought the position of the scholars that was published, I think in November 2023, I found it really particularly troubling. And when I see what's happening today, I see that we are witnessing like the most documented genocide in history unfolding before our eyes. And when you see that scholar actually based their research on documents, they are unable to just name what's going on, even though it is documented. And I think it's very, to me, very troubling. And it's almost impossible to discuss genocide and colonization without encountering like deep resistance. And as you said, I feel like we are really trapped in this framework of a so-called class of civilization, which is really problematic today. And things have to be named. I think we came to this point where things have to be said, and this racism against Palestinian and Arabs in general is today undeniable. And actually, it requires us from here to come back to our history here and how we came to this construction of racism, which is still going on today and allows us to witness this genocide without saying a word, which is, I mean, honestly, it's been a year and I think it's very troubling, and it's like keeping this normal life. It's really, really disturbing today. And also, I've been quite thinking a lot about the question of history, how we write history, and it's always based on this concept of memory. And since a year, I keep thinking that we are maybe, as a historian, maybe should focus on the fabric of oblivion rather than the memory, because when you do that, you just somehow, some stories, you understand why some stories are erased, why some stories can't be told, some voices are not heard. And I think it might illuminate this connection between history and politics and help us understand why some narratives are so silenced. And this also, I'm sorry, it's just 2 points.
Sure.
We keep hearing response. It's been a year we're hearing response repeatedly, response, response, response. It's like keeping the focus on the fact that this was a response. So it started the 7th of October, and it just can't, by repeating it, we just cannot focus on maybe the 7th of October was the response of something that happened before. And I think it might be interesting just to focus a little bit more on this concept of response. And finally, I mean, I kept having some hopes through the year. I thought that maybe something might happen and something might change, since a few days ago and the violation of the UN Convention, the 1974 UN Convention with Syria. And honestly, for me, it got another level of scary. But at the same time, I think that we are seeing a really big change in the civil society. And I think there are also new voices, not only Palestinian voices, but also activist voices. And I think they're also producing knowledge, and which is quite interesting. And I keep seeing all those websites that are actually documenting, archiving, like there is somehow a portion of archives, which is quite interesting in the civil society. And maybe these activists are also something, they can teach us something. And I think it's also interesting to see what's going on outside of the institution, because we have to see that today they're really fragile. What's happening, people do not trust the institution anymore, either the university, the ICJ or whatever. And this is also, it concerns us here as well. And I think we haven't grappled the consequences that is happening here, not only in Palestine. So that's it.
If there are if we can collect a couple of questions, also if people want to, and then.
Also, first of all, I really wanted to thank you for speaking about this and for using the language that you use and not refraining from it. I just wanted to quickly ask about your view on how the US elections might affect the relations between Israel and the US.
First, I think the point of genocide studies is to know genocides in a way that we can prevent them. So, if we are in this situation right now where we have identified this as a genocide, but we cannot prevent it. Yeah, it keeps happening, and United States keep delivery of weapons. So, what do you think is now really the point of this discipline if there are not real consequences, as all the scholars says something is a genocide?
One more there.
Thank you for your presentation. I appreciate your efforts for this difficult question. So my question is complex. So what can we do with all that? Because of course it's the topic about, if it's only about to divide secularity with religion, because of course they fight for a state of the land. If it's not just a land, it's a holy land. So what can we do with that? Because we have a lot of countries who believe in God, and especially USA. So it's difficult. What can we do?
Okay. There was one more there, but maybe. Okay. Yeah. No, yeah, maybe just, and then I'll answer together, hopefully.
So for me, actually, my question is, do you think that the Palestinian people maybe are victims also of strategies of Hamas and Hezbollah? And what did those organizations do?
And what's the second part?
The second part is, what did organizations like Hamas and Hezbollah do before 7th of October to work towards peace and to protect actually the people of Gaza?
Okay. So, I mean, the international legal and political system after World War II has absolutely failed, right? We live in a world of 117 million forcibly displaced people, right? We live in a world with a lot of mass violence, with some of it recognized as genocide, like Rohingyas' assault against, Myanmar's assault against the Rohingya, for example. We live in a world that, there was indeed a lot of, there was and is a lot of mistrust, distrust of institutions, as you said, international legal institutions. And because Israel is so foundational to the international political and international legal system after World War II, we see that this is why I think that there's also potential for significant change. Now, this is the reason, how do we see the significant change, right? Why are so many people, it wasn't by accident, of course, that it was a global South state, South Africa, that brought the charge of genocide against Israel in the ICJ, right? Now, why do so many global South people, primarily? Because again, when we think about the states, by the way, in the global South, they're usually very similar to the states in the global North, right? Think about Turkey, think about Pakistan, right? These are states that their interests, their key interests align, right, with the international system, right? But when we think about people in the global, what we call the global South, why are they rallying around the issue of Gaza? Not necessarily because they know a lot about Israel and about Palestinians and about Palestine, or even about Israel's attack on Gaza now. They're rallying around it because they are seeing in this case, right, the potential for unbelievable challenge of the international political and legal system that has, of course, failed them, right? If we think about colonialism that you mentioned, right? And in the field of Holocaust and genocide studies, right, there's this kind of, still in a way continued for about 20 years now, ongoing debate on the issue of, colonialism and the Holocaust, for example, right? I mean, one of the reasons that the Holocaust, that it was important to make the Holocaust unique after World War II was precisely to disconnect the Holocaust and Nazism from colonial genocides, right? There's a history of a few hundred years of colonial genocides, right? I mean, the British Empire starved 30 million people in India at the end of the 19th century, for example, right? There was a need to disconnect the Holocaust from colonial genocide, to create this hierarchy, right? In order to reaffirm the supremacy of the West, right? And to maintain a narrative about modern progress, right? Where Nazism and the Holocaust are effectively an accident. So there's an opportunity now, because we're seeing colonial violence very clearly, and because we're seeing it rationalized by Holocaust scholars, right? Because they're operating from this idea that the Holocaust is exceptional. So we're seeing this language in our face, as you saw, right? Published. It's not, hidden, hushed. So we are at it's a horrific time, and there's nothing. I mean, in a way, there's nothing. Genocide is final, right? I mean, I'm a scholar of the Holocaust. The Nazi genocide. If we think about the East European Jewish world that had existed, in the case of Poland, for example, for 1,000 years, right, and for hundreds of years across Eastern Europe, right, it's gone, right, and it's never coming back. That's it. It was a very successful genocide. Many genocides are very successful, right? There's nothing left almost of Gaza, right? Gaza, as it was before the 7th of October, right, is destroyed. And in some sense, that's the reality that and it's crushing, right? As you said, right? So, but it also places us in this moment of incredible potential for change. And if we think about prevention, right? Israel, we know because the Israeli government is telling us openly, right? That, and now, who asked about elections? Elections? Oh, yes. And now there is significant danger that with the incoming Trump administration, Israel will simply annex the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and wants to annex the West Bank and East Jerusalem in any case, and intensify further the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. So if we think about prevention, right, then we still need to think about stopping the violence, which is incredibly urgent. But we also need to think about millions of Palestinians under military occupation, Israeli military occupation in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. And we also need to think about almost 2 million Palestinian citizens of Israel who are arguably in incredible danger, right? They are the enemies within, right? Like Tutsi in Rwanda in 1994, like Armenians in the Ottoman Empire at the beginning of World War I, right? The enemies within, right? So if we think about prevention, prevention is still very much a framework that's important. This is the reason that I say that I definitely don't think that we should do away with international law. I definitely don't think that we should do away with the concept of genocide, for example. I think that we have an opportunity now to transform the international legal system. And we're seeing it, as I said last evening, right? If the chief prosecutor of the ICC, Karim Khan, who was a key figure in maintaining this system of impunity for Israel, right, has requested arrest warrants, has said in, I have it here, just a second, this is worth quoting, because when he requested the arrest warrants, he also had this kind of video press release, right, which is very exceptional. Don't do this in the ICC. For whatever reason, they did it. But the press release was actually very important because he said the following. Listen carefully. He said, "Today we underline in the clearest possible fashion that international law and the laws of armed conflict apply to everyone. No one can act with impunity. I call upon and count on all states, especially state parties to the Rome Statute, to approach this application with the same seriousness they have shown in other situations." And then he said, "It is my strong conviction that if we do not demonstrate our willingness to apply the law equally, if it is seen as applied selectively, we will be creating the conditions for its complete collapse. This is the true risk we face at this perilous moment," right? So Karim Khan recognizes that the US doesn't want international law. Israel doesn't want international law, right? That itself is a reason for us to want international law, right? And to see the potential of transforming international law. And again, I mentioned this yesterday in the discussion, right? Recently, we have an advisory opinion by the International Court of Justice about the illegality of the Israeli occupation. That's a separate case. Have you heard about this? It's an advisory opinion, so it's not a ruling, but it's still incredibly important because now it means, I mean, it took a long, long time to reach a conclusion that was in front of our eyes all the time, right? And this is a case that started before the 7th of October, right? It means that the Israeli occupation in its entirety, all of it, not just individual acts, right, is illegal in international law, right? This has incredible implications, right? Specifically for sanctions and divestment, because now it's about the law, right? If you collaborate with a state that violates the law in this way, right, that opens the door now for unbelievable sanctions. And we're already seeing this, actually, with the ICJ ruling about the plausibility of genocide, and unbelievable uptick in divestment and sanctions with real impact. So yes, genocide prevention, the international legal system, we are in a process of change. I think that you touched, I don't know if that's what you meant, stopping to put our focus on memory, right? And looking at erasure or... Now, one of the, I want to say about this, something that's very important, because with the way that we think about memory, specifically in relation to the Holocaust, right, is tied also a lot to this concept of trauma. Okay? Now, one of the problems with thinking about memory and trauma, right, is that it easily leads us into this idea, right, that after the Hamas attack on Israel on 7th of October, right, this activated, right, Jewish traumas in Israel, right, in a way that, again, if we are in this weaponized discourse, right, this kind of serves a purpose in this, or not a purpose, but it figures within this weaponized discourse, right, to rationalize an attack like the one that we're witnessing now for over 14 months, right? Because there are traumas, there are fears. So I ask, right, we have thousands of videos of Israeli soldiers and officers from Gaza. They themselves have documented their crimes and uploaded them to social media because they think that they're fighting barbarians, right? So this is colonial warfare. By the way, this is the origins of international law. The origins of international law are to regulate war between civilized nations. It was never meant to apply to colonial warfare, right? That's why we have these thousands of videos, which are incredible. They're documenting, there's so much evidence, right? Because it's provided to us. Now, when you look at those videos, I don't know if you've seen any of those videos, right? Some of them are more horrific than others, right? Is there fear? Do we see trauma? No. Celebration of mass killing, celebration of violence. So this is one of the issues that we definitely are now in a moment to reconsider, the way that we think about, that we study, that we teach, that we imagine memory in relation to the Holocaust, and then more broadly mass atrocities, is very much infused with this issue of trauma, right? And this is one of its effects that we need to certainly reconsider, right? U.S. elections and U.S. elections, Hamas, Hezbollah, right? You asked about them. There's a question about religion, the role of religion here. Yes. And what can we do? You asked what can we do? You asked what? Okay. Look, the U.S. elections in relation to Israel and Gaza, I mean, there's, in that sense, you know, there has never been a more supportive administration in U.S. history for Israel than the Biden administration, right? Which supports Israel now in crude violation of U.S. law, right? You're not allowed to provide, according to U.S. law, to provide weapons, right, when there's clear documentation of violations of international law like this. So of course, then, you know, we have to witness weekly this theater of the spokespeople of the Biden administration telling us that there's an investigation, that they're waiting for the Israelis, right, to investigate their violations of international law, and so on and so forth. But there's never been a more supportive administration. And if there's something that's relevant to the story, I mean, again, it was horrific under Biden, right? But we'll all see now, right, the manifestation of the truth that things could always get worse, right? But what's important is that this U.S. elections, right, also showed us, for example, what many U.S. elections show us, right, that settler colonialism, right, is a non-issue across the political spectrum in the U.S. Democrats, Republicans, right, left, liberals, whatever you want to. Why? Because as I said, when we think about really why we see this level of support of Israel by the U.S., right? 14-month, I mean, increasing isolation of Israel, also the U.S., by the way. Why? Because if we recognize what's happening, then we have to recognize what Israelis are telling us that they're doing, right? Now we are in explicit declarations of settler colonialism in Gaza, right? We need to occupy Gaza. We need to settle it, right? They're doing it already, right? So if we need to come to terms with settler colonialism, which is, as I said, constantly denied and blurred and disavowed, right? That brings the settler colonial genie out of the bottle. And if it's out of the bottle, we have to deal with settler colonialism also everywhere, also in the US, right? Where it's also denied and blurred and marginalized and no one in the US wants to deal with settler colonialism, right? Americans prefer to think, for example, that indigenous people are a thing of the past, right? Then we can, have our acknowledgement statements that we've stolen their land, we've deported them, we've killed them, we've destroyed them, and now we're on their land, right? But they're not a thing of the past, of course, right? No one wants to come to terms with this in the US. It's a complete non-issue in the US. But this too is now part of this moment of change, right? So there's incredible potential for significant change. And we're seeing this potential specifically, someone said here you said as well, from civil society from below. I said yesterday, the massive demonstrations in the fall in the US and elsewhere arguably pushed South Africa to submit the case against the charge of genocide against Israel in the ICJ, right? From below, we see incredible potential for change, right? And that's when we think what to do, right? What to do. I think you mentioned hope as well, right? As I said, I don't think that hope has anything. I mean, it's not about. I'm usually very hopeless, and certainly in the last 14 months, and very pessimistic. But it has nothing to do with being hopeless or hopeful. What it has to do with is what we actually do, right? And that's, again, I said it last evening, and I think it's very important. We've seen it in the fall. We've seen it in the encampments in university campuses in the spring, that collective action to push this potential for change is incredibly important. It's incredibly important. And how do we know that it's incredibly important, right? On university campuses, outside of university campuses, because of the levels of repression, right? I live in Philadelphia. The University of Pennsylvania, together with the police of the university in the US, the universities have their own police departments, right? The police of the University of Pennsylvania, together with the city police of Philadelphia, right, who are incredibly violent, raided a couple months ago student housing, raided as in police raid with automatic weapons, right? A housing where students who are, active against Israel's genocide in Gaza, right? This is the craziness that shows us how effective, right, the mobilization is, the collective action is, right? So what to do? Yeah, we can look on the level of, the politics in the U.S. It doesn't tell us anything new, right? What we can do in various ways, as I said yesterday, in this mobilization, and that's in essence what it is, right, is an insistence on what's been denied and disavowed also within Holocaust and genocide studies, also by scholars of the Holocaust, right, to insist on the truth. This is where we are today. Insisting on documented reality in front of our eyes has become a radical act, right? A radical act that the authorities are incredibly in panic mode. Think what needs to happen so that the university sends its police force with automatic weapons against its students. And of course, it didn't happen only in the University of Pennsylvania, right? It happened in many, many campuses. I do want to say just one more thing about your question on Hamas and Hezbollah. On Hamas, look, as I said yesterday, I mean, and in the first piece that I published after 7th of October in Jewish Currents, I referred specifically to the Hamas-led attack on Israel as a case of mass murder and clear evidence of war crimes, right? Now, it's a matter of fact, and that, like any groups, right, Palestinians among themselves don't agree on everything, right? Also not on Hamas. But we do have to say one thing that's very important, right? And again, what I'm going to say is not in any way justifies mass murder. In any way, right? What happened on the 7th of October placed back on the agenda, right, the issue of the Nakba, right? The Nakba was, as in Holocaust and genocide studies, again, this goes back to the Institutes of Global Holocaust Memory, to the field of Holocaust and genocide studies, to how scholars in my field, right, think, imagine, write, teach, right? Nakba denial is structural in that, right? We don't talk about Israel is exceptional. We don't talk about the Nakba. We don't talk about the ongoing Nakba. 1 million settlers, almost 1 million Jewish settlers in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, which is just in itself a crude violation of international law, for decades, right? We don't talk about it. Perfectly fine, right? In the summer of 2023, before the 7th of October, EHRI, EHRI, which is the European Holocaust Remembrance something. I don't remember. Okay, good. Thank you, Peter. Which actually coordinates work on archives primarily, held its meeting in Jerusalem at Yad Vashem, right? At a time when every day settlers and Israeli police and soldiers were killing Palestinians in the West Bank and in East Jerusalem, right? Not a word was uttered about this, of course, in the EHRI meeting in Jerusalem, right? With Holocaust scholars in attendance. Nakba denial, right, brought us to the 7th of October. And what happened on the 7th of October which is a case of mass murder. It's, as I said yesterday, without a doubt, the largest massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. It was, but a completely different context than the Holocaust. The context is the Nakba, the ongoing Nakba, Israeli settler colonialism, right? That is now back on the agenda. Indeed, right? If we think about the international legal system and how it's based on Nakba denial, as I explained, right? In relation to the crime of genocide, right? Now Nakba is back on the international. Everyone now, in the CCR case, the Center for Constitutional Rights, the case that was filed in court in California against Biden, Blinken, and Austin, Palestinians testified for 5 hours, right, about the Nakba and the ongoing Nakba, their own experiences, family experiences from 48 until Gaza today. 5 hours in federal court, right? Now we have Nimr Sultani in Journal of Genocide Research talking about the ongoing Nakba. This is a massive change, right? There is no justification for mass murder, and I have zero sympathy for perpetrators of mass murder anywhere, at any time, in any conditions. Zero, right? But we have to realize that one key thing that this did was this central issue, right, of, as we started, basically denying the existence of Palestinians, right? There are no Palestinians, reaffirming this Zionist imaginary, right, of a people without a land for a land without a people, making it reality, because of course there were people. So I hope that this clarifies my position, right, about Hamas, but it also clarifies my position, right, about, as you said, history didn't start on the 7th of October. It didn't start on the 7th of October, right? So, final comment, just so it will be very clear, right? What to do, particularly, right, in Israel-Palestine today, right? What to do? I mean, there's unfolding genocide. So what to do to come to terms with this history and ongoing reality, right? And, making it very clear that what to do involves everyone who is there. The 7.5 million Jews and the 7.5 million Palestinians, right? What to do is not a state that's based on Jewish supremacy, not a state that's based on the denial of its foundational crime, not a state that's based on the erasure of Palestinians, right? But a state that recognizes, or a political arrangement, 2-state, 1-state, 3-state, 5 states. The advisory opinion of the ICJ, by the way, about the illegality of the Israeli occupation, makes the 2-state option nearer than ever, by the way, because it tells us that the advisory opinion actually says that Israel is obligated now to end its occupation. That's effectively the 2 states, for example. But whatever happens, 1 state, 2 states, whatever it is, right? Whatever configuration, federation, there's so many possibilities and models, actually. I think we're in one now. No, Belgium, right? It's supposed to be based on the recognition of everyone's dignity, everyone's belonging to the place, everyone's rights, everyone's humanity. It's not that complex, actually, right? And then, if there's anything we can learn from the 7th of October, as I said yesterday, right, is that the promise of security in the ethno-national Jewish supremacist framework of the Israeli state, that was the promise of Zionism, right? Jewish security in the Jewish state, right? It hasn't worked out well, because how can you have security when you hold millions of people for decades under military occupation, siege, humiliate them, rob their land, deny it at the same time? And we have to remember, the Israeli Palestinians were held immediately under military rule, those who survived the Nakba within Israel, 156,000 people from 1948 to 1966. And then came 1967 and the military occupation of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip, right? Israel was never a democracy. Democracies don't hold their own citizens under military rule. So what to do? To create a truly decolonial democratic future. And we are now in this moment, this, again, on the one hand, incredibly horrific moment, right? But on the other hand, a moment with incredible potentials for change, also for realizing, in whatever political constellation, this sort of future.
Thank you, Raz. I think we all agree that we live in very dark times, living through horrible things, but what probably also demoralizes us even more profoundly is the lack of courage we see around us, the lack of courage to speak up, but maybe also the courage to think things through. And I honestly think, Raz, really needed you to come here. You brought a spark of hope and a spark of light with your exceptional courage indeed to speak out, but also the courage to think things through. It doesn't just stop with Gaza. It goes with the visions we have of our history, of Holocaust history, of genocide history, of colonial history, of the ideological frameworks of the world we inhabit. And it is so rare to have somebody who has the courage not just to speak up, but to talk through, to think through. So thank you very much. We needed you to come. Please know that you have true friends in the Université Libre de Bruxelles, whatever may come. Thank you very much. So for having been with us for these 4 nights. Thank you very much.